Founded in 2010, our ambition is to have the ideas we advance drive the national conversation and ensure Canada is the best governed country in the world. So as you can imagine, we have a lot of work to do. And in so doing, speak fearlessly and independently. We are the most cited think tank in Canada's Parliament, and our experts, some of whom are here today, are routinely cited in Parliament and called to testify before a parliamentary committee. Our author's writing appears in the national and international media on average once a day, every day of the year. We're also proud that we've attracted some attention outside of Canada, having been formally blacklisted by the regimes in both the Kremlin and Beijing, a fact of which we are immensely proud. Now, ladies and gentlemen, tonight's conversation actually represents the first in what will be a series of similar MLI events to be held in Vancouver, featuring speakers you may not be able to hear elsewhere in Canada, apparently because they're just too controversial. These events are made possible due to the support of a generous benefactor who wishes to remain anonymous, but to whom we are, of course, extremely grateful. As we are also for the organizational support of my colleagues from MLI, some local friends here in Vancouver, and in particular, MLI Senior Fellow and Professor of Philosophy at UBC Okanagan, Dr. Andrew Irvin. Before I get to the introductions, a few housekeeping items. The format for this evening will be a 1-hour conversation, followed by 30 minutes of time for questions from the audience. After the formal program ends, we'd invite everyone to join us in the lobby for cocktails and hors d'oeuvres, which will run until 8:30. Finally, while you're welcome to take pictures tonight, we would please ask that you refrain from sharing them, especially on social media, until after the conclusion of this evening's events. And with that, the introductions. Dr. Brian Lee Crowley is the founder and managing director of the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is a former visiting economist at the Federal Department of Finance, a former member of the editorial board at the Globe and Mail, a former Salvatore Fellow at the Heritage Foundation in Washington, D.C., and founder of the Atlantic Institute for Market Studies. He's published 6 books, including most recently Gardeners versus Designers, Understanding the Great Fault Line in Canadian Politics. He holds degrees from McGill University in Montreal and the London School of Economics, including a doctorate in political economy from the latter, where his doctoral thesis focused on F.A. Hayek's social and political philosophy. Douglas Murray is a best-selling author and journalist based in New York. He's one of the UK's leading conservative political commentators. His latest book, The War on the West, was the #1 bestseller in both the New York Times and Sunday Times, and seeks to defend Western culture against what he regards as a barrage of unjust criticism for perceived past wrongdoings. He's also author of 2 other Sunday Times bestsellers, The Madness of Crowds, Gender, Race, and Identity from 2019, and The Strange Death of Europe, Immigration, Identity, and Islam, 2017. He's been a contributor to The Spectator since 2000, and associate editor of the magazine since 2012. He is a columnist at the New York Post and The Sun and hosts the Uncancelled History podcast, and I have no idea how he has time to do a speaker series while doing all of this. In 2007, he founded the Center for Social Cohesion, the first think tank in Britain to study extremism and terrorism, which subsequently became part of the Henry Jackson Society, where he held the position of associate director from 2011 to 2018. A prolific debater, he has spoken on a variety of prominent platforms, including the British and European parliaments and the White House. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Brian Lee Crowley and Douglas Murray.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. We're delighted to have you with us tonight. But I know that you're here to hear from Douglas Murray, so I'm going to get right into it. The title that we gave to this event internally was In Defense of Western Civilization. And so I'm going to start with that theme, if I could, Douglas. The rejection of historical figures like Winston Churchill and Sir John A. Macdonald, our first Prime Minister here in Canada, the shame associated in many minds with our past for things like the transatlantic slave trade, the displacement of Indigenous people by colonialism and empire. All of this seems to be an unassailable truth to many in the academy and their students. Is Western civilization worth defending?
First of all, thank you to the MLI, and thanks to all of you for turning out this evening. I'm looking forward to this very much. Well, obviously, I think it is, and I'm rather surprised by how few people are doing it. And I think that the explanation for that is that so many people feel bullied into not saying things that everyone said until yesterday. And I've noticed a pattern in recent years on quite a wide range of subjects where something slightly counterintuitive is happening. You mentioned the attacks on very popular figures like Winston Churchill. When these things happen, they baffle a lot of people. And they baffle them because if you wanted to create a coalition of people to agree with you politically, you would ordinarily not go for their holiest places. No? You'd maybe pick off a couple of people at the sides, but you wouldn't, if you wanted to create a coalition, you wouldn't go for the roots of Canada or the founding fathers in America. You know, when I first moved to New York a few years ago, I moved just as the statue of Thomas Jefferson was being taken down from City Hall. And he was crated up, boxed out, and wheeled past through the back door. And his statue had been there since the 1830s. And one of the current council members who voted to remove the statue of Thomas Jefferson said, I thought somewhat presumptuously, that the reason she had voted for the removal of the statue of Thomas Jefferson was because he, quote, does not represent our values. I thought that was very telling because, of course, if Thomas Jefferson doesn't represent your values in America, who does? And I suspect that if the councilwoman in question could have been honest ever, she would have said, well, me, obviously. In other words, it's an extraordinary land grab that is going on. It is not an attempt to make a gradualist improvement of the society. It's an attempt to go right to the foundational sacred points of the society and to detonate them. And this is, by the way, I mean, it's a bit of a tangent, but bear with me. This is similar with other social movements that are going on at the moment. I wrote in The Madness of Crowds a little bit about the trans stuff and said there, the same phenomenon I just mentioned happens there, which is if you wanted to get more sympathy for people born with intersex conditions, for instance, you'd start with that. You wouldn't start with, you've got to agree that the big bearded man has the right to be in the women's weightlifting. You just wouldn't. It's a crazy place if you want to get a coalition together. But again, they don't want to get a coalition. They just want to go right for the root of it and take that out. Now, with Western civilization, I mean, this has been going on for, as you know, I mean, certainly 40 years now. It's 40 years almost since Jesse Jackson led the chants at American campuses of, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western civ has got to go, which is asinine in every way. But you know, that's from the 80s pretty much onwards. And if you look at the courses in Western civilization that used to be taught in countries like this one, in America, in Australia and elsewhere, they've almost all disappeared. I mean, almost all gone. And to my mind, this is a great act of vandalism because my view is that the only way to create a civilized person is that they know where they're from. And they know where they're from, and all of the things that have come into them as all the tributaries to their minds and characters. And then they go out into the world and they discover other cultures and other ideas as well, and they get things from them. But if you start from the everything, you actually sort of are born and given nothing. You have no roots. And people have been noticing that for a while, from quite a bewildering array of directions, I'd say. I mean, Cardinal Ratzinger, my favorite recent pope, wrote a very, very good book in the 2000s called Without Roots, about what was happening in Europe, of the loss of the deep roots, where You know, famously when the European Constitution was being written, and by the way, I mean, if you ever want to see the difference between Thomas Jefferson's generation and the current generation, consider the beauty and the brevity of the American Constitution compared to the thousands of pages of boring bureaucracy that is
Single European Act.
the European Constitution, which nobody has read and survived. But famously, the European Constitution did not mention anywhere the Christian roots of Europe, and the Pope at the time mentioned this. But it didn't seem important to Brussels, as compared to, you know, Protocol 33.9.0, footnote 4. It's an extraordinary thing that has happened, and it's happened in our lifetimes. That the whole thing that this is based on, that a country like Canada is based on, that a country like Britain or America is based on, has been pulled away like a rug from underneath us. And those of us who still remember what we are currently, I think, not doing well in communicating to the generation coming up, who have been told a set of lies. And, sorry, this is a rather long answer, but just let me make one other point about this. The set of lies is this. And this is where you can tell that it's so politically weighted, so politically hostile, is everything about our societies is viewed in the solely negative light. But, and this is the tell, every other society is seen only in the most positive light. Let me say something very politically incorrect, but in Australia, for instance, they had a referendum recently, which happily the Australian public voted against. But one of the extraordinary things that was being put forward by the Yes group in that referendum was the idea that the indigenous peoples of Australia lived a sort of Edenic life, which we should be so lucky as to learn from. Now, maybe there is something to be taken from Aboriginal culture, but not much, and not everything, that's for sure. And I said in The War on the West, there's this whole movement now that has gone through every single subject. It started with the humanities and it went through STEM. I thought it wouldn't go through STEM, but it did. It went through economics even. It's now gone even to maths. And it's this movement that there are other ways of knowing. And that we get... Now, nobody, by the way, can ever explain what the other ways of knowing are. We just have to accept them on...
That's because you're a white supremacist.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what they would say. Whereas the point that I make is that the reason why, for instance, the Western system of music notation, which is currently being attacked everywhere because it's white supremacist, is used around the world not because it was invented by white people, but because it works. What is now being defamed as Western medicine is not working around the world because it's from white people or Western, it's because it works. And there's this extraordinary idea now that those things didn't come from us, or if they did, they're useless. And as I say, it always relies on this idea that what we have is bad and what everybody else have is good. And by the way, that is not we've had this for about 300 years. I said Jesse Jackson, but you could go back earlier. You could go back to Rousseau in France, who, as I mentioned in The War on the West, had this savage, I mean, brilliant critiques of Parisian society. And when Rousseau explains what other societies are like, you always have to bear in mind that he'd never been further than Switzerland. There's a great story I tell in the book of a French naval crew who end up in New Zealand. And because they'd read their Rousseau, they believed that the peoples of New Zealand would greet them as pacifists. And they were mainly slaughtered by the locals. And the people who did make it back to France had a rather low opinion of Rousseau afterwards. But the point is that But the point is that what Rousseau, and this is the tell, is what Rousseau was doing was talking about people he knew nothing about, but he wasn't talking about them. He was just trying to find a way to critique the Paris of his day. And that may be a perfectly reasonable thing to do, but to seize another culture or another aspect of another culture rather ignorantly in order to do so, I think is a great mistake.
But let's talk just a little bit more about why Western culture is worth defending, because you've talked a lot about some of the criticisms that have been made. But my view is that the greatest thing, the thing that the Enlightenment gave us, was the idea that reality was an objective thing that didn't depend on our feelings, didn't depend on authority. It was something that was discoverable by reason, and that reason was available to every human being. I think that's the great legacy of the Enlightenment. And it's completely antithetical to the idea that, well, there are other ways of knowing that you don't know anything about, but I know all about them, and you must, succumb to my superior knowledge of things that are inaccessible to you. And now we've got to the point where people are saying, well, 2 + 2 = 4 is a racist construct.
Yes. They didn't realize, the people who said that George Orwell's 1984 includes a scene where the people are demanded to agree that 2 + 2 = 5.
Yes.
And when that was put to one of the lunatics trying to make everyone agree that 2 + 2 = 4 is a white supremacist construct, beautifully enough, he didn't realize that this is in 1984, and he said, well, it's true that that's unfortunate. You bet.
But I mean, this belief that there is an objective reality which is beyond our, human will. It's just a fact, and that this objective reality is discoverable by reason. Isn't this exactly what's under attack?
Yes, and I mean the extraordinary thing about that is, when I was writing The War in the West and researching it, I was one of the things that was on my mind a lot was the thinkers who had come under particular assault in recent years. And one of the things I noticed was it was almost all of the thinkers of the Enlightenment.
Yes.
So David Hume, for instance, the great Scots philosopher, now in Edinburgh, everything with his name on it has been removed. And it's removed because there's one footnote in Hume's work, which all Hume scholars agree is racist by modern standards, and is very ugly and is partly strange because it's so uncharacteristic of the rest of his work. But it is quoted by very malevolent actors as if they have stumbled upon this during a reading of the collected works of David Hume. And I call BS on that. I think they have got just a hit list of like the worst things that various people said, or, as I always say, people are found guilty of living in the past. What were they doing, not having the views of the 2020s? They were living in the 1780s. People attack Churchill for having some Victorian attitudes. I think that's because he was born in Victorian England. I mean, if somebody born in 2000 had Victorian attitudes, that would be weird. But anyway, the point is that Hume, they attack for this, and they've tried to completely delegitimize him. And I thought, well, and one of the critiques of him is like, why wasn't he better on social justice and things? I think, well, among other things, he had work to do of a different kind, which he chose to do. The same with almost the only bit of cancellation that has happened in France, which is a country I much admire for its robustness, and not many people, from my background, say that. France, the only cancellation I think that has happened is that the statue of Voltaire has been attacked so many times it's been disappeared and is currently in a witness protection program, I think. And it's very interesting that people attack Voltaire because they attack him for having shares in a trading company that included slaves. They do not mention that Voltaire, of course, also gave one of the greatest condemnations of slavery as it was going on in Candide. But I wondered and I spoke to a lot of people about this, why is it all the Enlightenment thinkers they're coming for? And I think it comes down to what you just mentioned, that what we are going through in our current age is actually an overt assault on reason. Yeah. It is an overt assault on the idea that there are things that are demonstrably, provably true. That math as we call it in America. Math is there because it works. A rather cruel way of saying this, but I've said it before, so let me dive in again. When there is a global pandemic, people look to the form of science and medical knowledge that is developed in countries like this one. We do not go to native, knowledge. If you're suffering from cancer, you use the medicine that has been developed through the scientific method that has come up in countries and societies like this. If somebody said to me, I've decided to go and get my cancer treated by an Aboriginal tribe, I'm afraid I would know that they were going to die. And simply because the medical knowledge is not there. Now, that's not to, and the terribly cruel thing about what's happening at the moment is the implication that, therefore, people from different cultures can't contribute to what I regard as being the wellstream of general knowledge. There is no reason why somebody, by dint of their background, should be deemed to have another way of knowing. What they should have is the ability, and I hope they have, is the ability to contribute to the whole. And that is what we've been losing. And, but sorry, I mean, to say why should we defend it, it's because of all of these things. The West has produced things that work. We've produced the only political system that gives personal liberty to everybody in the society. We're the only societies that have, again, this is one of the perplexing things. Western societies are always attacked for racism, yet we're the only countries which care when we're criticized and called racist. No other society minds. If you called the Saudis racist,
What's your point?
What's your point? In China, the Chinese are very racist by Western standards. There's a Chinese word to describe white people that translates roughly as ghosts. Now, I don't particularly like that, but I don't mind it, and I'm certainly not going to go hollering around with a placard shouting at Chinese people because of it. But the point is that in China they don't care. And in most of the world they don't care. The fact that in the West we even care about these things is something.
Well, Douglas, you've come several times back to this theme, so I want to develop it a little more. The transatlantic slave trade hasn't existed for 2 centuries, and Britain was the first major civilization in history voluntarily to renounce slavery.
Yes.
And spent much blood and treasure and lives from the West Africa Squadron, amongst others, combating it, while the United States fought one of the bloodiest civil wars in history ever to keep the Union together and end slavery. And yet the West's involvement in that trade is now being used to support the accusation that the West and white people are uniquely evil in the history of the world. Why is the connivance of Africans in prosecuting the slave trade, or the much larger slave trade that happened in the Arab world compared to the transatlantic trade, or today's Chinese and Russian imperialism, why are all these things treated as of no consequence, whereas the West is uniquely evil?
I mean, again, it comes back to this deficit of knowledge. I mean, I hear from people all the time things like, we haven't apologized for slavery. I think you just don't know that we have. That's a different thing. When people say, there's not enough knowledge of the slave trade, I say, maybe you don't have enough knowledge, but that isn't the same thing as we. And you mentioned, of course, that the British Empire abolished slavery. There was a recent demand now. Every time a minor royal goes anywhere in the world, there's a demand that they apologize for slavery. And every time when the Wessexes or something, end up in the Bahamas and there's a protest with shakedown merchants saying that they've got to apologize for slavery and pay reparations again, I always say the same thing. King George III signed this into law in 1807. What are you talking about? And again, you get the recognition of the game that is actually going on. Because, as you mentioned, once somebody focuses on only your bad sides. And if you agree, if you know anything about history, everybody in the world slaved, and it was just so normal. It's in the Bible, it's in the Quran, everywhere. Everyone was assumed that slaving was acceptable. Again, Western civilization was remarkable in being the first civilization to realize the abhorrence of the slave trade. But it took a lot longer for everyone else, and indeed it's going on.
Yes.
And as I say, I've met people who have been born as slaves in Africa on my travels, and it's an extraordinary and haunting thing. But the people who now have become self-appointed experts in slavery by discovering that it used to happen, I just beg them to use what energies they have to, instead of opening up old wounds, to actually solve current problems. And if you realize that, for instance, there are more slaves in the world today than there were at the height of the transatlantic slave trade, you realize the scale of the problem. And yet, where do you hear that? You know, I'd love all those people who are so activist and so desperate to find meaning in their otherwise meaningless lives. I wish they'd divert their attentions to something where they could do something and could find meaning and could actually do good. There's no good you can do by digging up a 300-year-old dispute. There's a lot of good you can do by helping your neighbor.
So should people alive today be held responsible for wrongs done centuries ago to people who are now dead?
Well, I say that only if it's universal. Only if it's universal. If anyone is born into guilt, then it's got to go every way. And you try that. You try that. I mean, the future would be a scrum. No peoples in history have been perfect, just as no person is perfect. If you want to have the idea that some people are born into guilt, and that is something that is now being taught, particularly in America, and I think it's a moral obscenity. I think it would be obscene to go to, say, black people in America and say, you have inherited guilt because of something your forebears did. I think it would be obscene. And I think it's obscene to do that to white people. You can't do this to a child. And if you're going to do it, then, you know, as I say, be my guest, try it out, see how Turkey comes out of that. See whether or not you're actually, instead of solving old wounds, are not just going to rip a whole load of new ones open. But I think the whole idea of hereditary guilt, I mean, it must be in some way a sort of form of spilt Christianity, which a lot of our era consists of. Spilt Christianity, I mean, it's a phrase of T.E. Hilmes, but it's where the residue of a religion ends up forming new particles and starting new movements. And I think that if society sort of gives up on the Judeo-Christian idea, nevertheless, aspects of it remain. And where we had original sin, we now have a sort of selective original sin, or original sin by racial base, and I think that is hell.
So to listen to some people in authority, particularly those associated with the left, hate is everywhere. Hate is rampant.
Yes.
And opposing hate justifies some of the most extreme measures. For example, many people in this room will know that the government of Canada has just tabled a bill in Parliament that would make online hate speech punishable by up to life in prison.
Life?
Life.
You don't get life for murder, do you?
Well, exactly. And judges would be empowered to put people under house arrest on the grounds that those people might commit acts of hate. Not that they had, but that just on the grounds that they might. Now, you, on the other hand, repeatedly lament in your books the absence of other emotions in the way we talk to each other.
Yes.
Things like hope, reconciliation, and love. Is hate so prevalent, and can we make a central place for these other positive emotions?
Well, I mean, the very idea is utterly juvenile. which is why, if I may say something that's slightly abusive towards the country I'm sitting in, which is why it's pushed by your current government. Nobody who has thought for a moment about humankind could think you could eradicate hate. It's preposterous. I mean, I like to say, you know, after Justin Trudeau has managed to stop hate, what will he do next? Would he like to do gluttony? Sloth is on the table. Avarice, lust. I mean, these are parts of the human condition. You have to be a moral imbecile not to know this. And hate is an unpleasant thing, but it's ineradicable. It's able to be tempered, and sometimes, by the way, it's useful to use. The idea you can eradicate such a thing, I mean, everybody, all of us in our hearts have hate and the potential for hate. Part of the thing of mastering your life is to try to diminish it, to keep it down. But the idea that it can be eradicated, let alone eradicated by some petty bureaucrat, is, it shows that people have not thought about anything at all. And the idea, of course, that you can sort of go around and identify hate. Again, you know, my late friend Christopher Hitchens gave a great speech here in Canada probably about 15 years ago. I can't remember which university it was, somebody might know, where he addressed this when the Canadian Human Rights Tribunals were doing their thing. He said there, it's all about who decides what the hate is. Mm-hmm. I mean, I might decide tomorrow, if I was a lunatic, that everything that was ever said against me that was critical is hate. I could say it's anti-Douglas hate, and I'm not putting up with it anymore. And I'm going to go to the police station every day and bother them until everyone's nice to me. I mean, apart from anything, I mean, where do you even start? I mean, life is hateful. We all get old. We all die. Everyone we love will die. Is there anything the Canadian government can do about that?
Don't give them any ideas.
Absolutely. Well, of course, now you can be euthanized, so that takes that problem out. But these are preposterous ideas. And again, like, who is the person who decides what is hateful in this situation? My view is that the laws of the land on these things in most countries were pretty solid up until recently. And the only thing I regard in speech or anything else as warranting some kind of government intervention is incitement to violence. Yeah. But even the incitement to violence laws are very carefully written in most countries, precisely because it is so easy for somebody to take advantage of it and pretend that actually whenever somebody says something mean about them, it's incitement to violence. No, incitement laws are very, very carefully worded. You know, and my view is it has to literally be, you know, a mob outside somebody's house and somebody is standing there and saying, "Get this person." Everything south of that is what we used to call life, and just putting up with things. And you know, my friend Fleming Rose, who made some international headlines some years ago when he commissioned a set of cartoons in Denmark, which didn't go unnoticed in parts of the world, wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, because he didn't realize what he was wading into when he did that. He was a former Soviet correspondent for the Danish newspapers and an expert in totalitarianism. But he really didn't realize quite how seriously his life was going to be affected by that. But he wrote a very good book called The Tyranny of Silence, which is a reflection of somebody who has spent many years thinking about speech and hate speech and so on. And he said something I wish was better known. He said, when you have a very, very diverse society, as ours have all become, you basically have two directions you can go with speech. You either decide that the authorities have the duty to police speech utterly, or people in the society have to become aware that they have to get used to hearing a lot of opinions. And as he says, the second is far preferable to the first, you know.
I can't help myself, since you mentioned Canada and some of the things going on here. In October last year, you published an op-ed in the National Post, the headline of which was, "Canada's descent into ignorance shocks the world." And the subhead was, "An unbearable stupidity has trickled down from the Liberal government." And you know, you don't express yourself clearly, Douglas. Do you?
I always leave room for...
Do you have no love for Canada?
I have a great deal of love for Canada. It's why I wrote that. I can't remember what the specifically idiotic thing was that they'd done that prompted that. There's such a litany that I wonder what it was.
Oh, I think it was the Nazi event in Parliament.
Yes, of course, of course. Yes. That was beautiful in a way, wasn't it? That people who see Nazis everywhere, you know,
can't identify a real one.
Can't identify a real one, and actually invite them. I mean, it was so fantastically demonstrative of, again, it goes back to this, you know, who decides in the society once you get into this nannying place of, you know, hate and eradicating hate and everything's got to be anti-hate and, you know, who decides? Who's competent? I mean, it turned out that the speaker here, far from competent, unfortunately. The whole of the House that stood, actually far from competent. If anyone knows their Ukrainian history, by the way, you could work it out for yourself. You really could. I dread to think what was going through Zelensky's head as he saw everyone stand up and felt he had to as well. But anyone who knows about Ukrainian history would have known if you were fighting the Russians in Ukraine, you were not part of the proto-democratic Ukrainian government. But this is the thing. Who has the right to decide or to say or to tell you or me what we can write or say? And the answer is people utterly unqualified to do so. And it's not just that they are unqualified, anyone is unqualified. Anyone. As Christopher said in that speech in Canada years ago, you know, who is the person you would nominate to decide which books I can read? Who would you nominate? Who do you know who's good enough? Who do you know who's virtuous enough and wise enough and always will be? I'm waiting for a nomination. I've never heard one.
I think our Prime Minister would volunteer for that job.
Yes, I said on stage with Jordan Peterson a few months ago, I don't like to tread on people's private lives, but when your Prime Minister announced his separation from his wife, I said it's probably the first time a man has divorced his wife because he wants to spend more time with himself.
So, Douglas, if we could shift gears just a little bit to it's still on this theme of Western values, but I want to talk about something that I think is looming very large in your mind right now, and that's Israel in the Middle East. Mm-hmm. Does Israel's continued existence as a lonely outpost of the kind of Western values we've been talking about in the Middle East present a peculiar and particular moral challenge to the West?
Yes, I think it does. I think it's at the forefront of the challenge. I've always found it a subject of extraordinary interest and oddity that the one country in the Middle East that most of us would wish to live in or could live in is the country that is most defamed and attacked, vilified and lied about. I find it an extraordinarily rich subject, actually. There's a novel I'm very fond of that by Vasily Grossman, the great Russian 20th century writer. I don't know if any of you have read, but Life and Fate. It's probably the great Russian novel of the 20th century. Grossman was actually Jewish himself. He was a reporter. His journalism was stunning. He was at Stalingrad for most of it, if you can imagine that. And he was also the first journalist into Treblinka. And his account of that is something to behold. Anyhow, Life and Fate, his great 900-page novel, travels through the midnight of the 20th century, from the camps to the gulags. And there's something very, very interesting that Grossman did, which is at the very middle of the novel, about the midnight of the 20th century, he devotes 3 pages to the subject of anti-Semitism. And I wish it was better known. I suppose it's sort of inevitable that in a 900-page novel, not everyone makes it halfway through, but I wish it was better known because he says almost everything you need to know about anti-Semitism. He says he says you find it in the Academy of Sciences and in the games children play in the yard. But this is the crucial insight he makes. He says, everywhere and always, it is a mirror of the person making the accusation. He says, show me what you accuse the Jews of, I'll tell you what you're guilty of. Mm-hmm. This seems to me utterly, demonstrably, visibly true. Mm. And I'm, again, anti-Semitism, like hate, we had a Labour leader in Britain a few years ago. He was an anti-Semite, Jeremy Corbyn. And I mean, he was so anti-Semitic that he would attend wreath layings for the terrorists who killed the Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics. That's an odd thing to do if you're not an anti-Semite. He used to say, when he was cornered, he would say, that's why we have, when he was cornered on his history of anti-Semitism, he would sometimes say things like, that's why we have to eradicate anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and all forms of racism. And I always used to say, you know, the very first part of that demonstrates you've never thought about it. Because anyone who's ever thought about anti-Semitism knows that it's almost certainly ineradicable. It is a perverse thing in the human condition, a desire to lock onto a group that you identify as being responsible for whatever you want to accuse them of. And as my late friend Rabbi Jonathan Sachs used to say, you know, when the Jews didn't have a state, they were attacked for being stateless. And then when they have a state again, they're attacked for having a state. But that's common throughout the history of anti-Semitism. I mean, the Jews were criticized for being religious and for being secular. They were criticized for being rich and being poor. They were criticized for being the Rothschilds and Russian peasants. They shtetl livers. They were, there's an extraordinary book that Tom Stoppard introduced me to by someone called Gregor von Retzori, called, rather lurid title, called The Memoirs of an Anti-Semite. But it has an extraordinary passage in it in which this young man growing up in Habsburg, Austro-Hungary, takes a Jewish woman who he's in love with, who's been older than him, out for dinner. And during dinner, he meets some people he knows from his cavalry unit. And the woman he's with, he knows what they're thinking, and he knows what they're thinking of him. And the scene culminates in him slapping the woman because he is horrified by her desire to behave like everyone else. And this also points to this extraordinary thing, because the Jews are criticized when they integrate and when they don't. And so what we see at the moment, I think, is just a new version of a very, very old hatred. And people sometimes say, well, that's too easy. Surely you can be anti-Israeli without being anti-Semitic. And I think not really. Or if you spend all of your attentions focusing on the one Jewish state in the world and not on any of the neighboring states, I won't let you get away with that. And yes, it's pretty extraordinary. I wrote an op-ed this week in the Post saying that I'm very struck. I've been in Israel for most of the last few months, since October, for various reasons, one of which was that I knew immediately it happened that we would have Holocaust denial in real time. I knew that people would start saying it hadn't happened and all that sort of thing. And my experience is the best way to counter that is to see things with your own eyes. So I've been there most of the time until last week, actually. And the year before, I was in Ukraine with the Ukrainian army when they're making advances. And I wrote this piece this week saying it's rather striking, actually. My friend Neil Ferguson gave me this idea in a piece. It's rather striking that there's an utter difference between the way these two conflicts that I've seen with my own eyes are reported, written about, and discussed. I don't think we've seen Russian students attacked on campuses, so far as I know. I'd deprecate it if they were. I don't think we've seen Russian embassies assaulted or protested. Nobody says that Ukraine must only win a little bit or is calling for a ceasefire. I mean, your Prime Minister, sorry, I don't want to zone in again, but your Prime Minister is one of several Western leaders who seems to get a certain sense of machismo by standing beside Zelensky, and good for him. But none of them call for ceasefire in Ukraine. They call for victory. And they want victory all the way. They say, we'll arm them as much as possible until they win. And one of the perverse things I've noted, I've covered most wars in Israel since 2006, one of the perverse things about every war involving Israel is that Israel's never allowed to win. And every single time they're accused of genocide, 2009, with a relatively minor operation in the Gaza, they were accused of genocide. And I wrote a piece the other day saying, if you add up all of the dead of all of the wars involving Israel from all sides, from and including the War of Independence in 1948, when Israel's neighbors all tried to eradicate it and strangle it at birth, you get up to a death toll of something like 65,000 people. And that's using the highest death tolls on the Arab side.
And that's dead on both sides?
On both sides, in every war involving Israel from 1948 to now. That is 6 months of average killing in Syria for the last 13 years. Something like 400,000 people have been killed in Yemen in the last few years. Again, 5 times the number of every war involving Israel on all sides. I see no protests about this. I mean, don't tell me this comes from a good place. Don't insult my intelligence.
So I wanted to ask you, has covering the Israeli-Hamas conflict as a journalist, has it changed you as a person?
Gosh, that's a difficult question.
That's why I asked it.
Well, in some ways, I mean, there's a scene in a novel by Ian McEwan, a great writer, called A Child in Time, which starts with a very evocative scene of a mother in a supermarket, and her child is abducted in the supermarket. And the incredibly evocative thing about this opening is that the mother, when she realizes that her child has been snatched, starts to yell and scream and try to get attention. And there's a moment in which the other people around don't know what's happening, can't understand, are embarrassed by her, start to move away. And then there's a moment when the other people realize a child has been kidnapped. And McEwan describes it as being like a glass shelter over everyone that suddenly smashed. And suddenly everyone is in the real world. Something terrible has happened. The glass smashed in Israel on the 7th of October in an extraordinary way. And the Israelis have been reminded of something they haven't seen for half a century, certainly not since 1973. And most people in Western countries certainly have forgotten, which is sheer evil. You can't, I sort of think it's part of my job as a writer to stare into the face of it, but it's pretty brutal seeing and hearing all the details. I mean, I'm very haunted by not just what happened in the kibbutz, the villages and towns, but the one in particular which haunts me is the Nova Party, because I've spent some time with the survivors and been to some of their reunions, and these are all people, for the young people here, these are all people who were just up for a party. And if this had been in Canada, and this was a roving party that went around the world, if it had been in Canada, there are people here who would have been there, and you'd know people who were there. If it had been in Britain, I'd known people who were there, and so on. And I'm stunned. I'm stunned by two things. One is the sheer horror, and the second is the sheer lack of empathy outside of Israel. I'm stunned by it. I mean, can you imagine what it's like? Obviously, some of these people are on mind-altering drugs and party drugs and things. Can you imagine what it would be like to be coming up on a mind-enhancing drug and then stare into the face of utter evil? I mean, some of the people who were there, their minds have collapsed. Some of the young people have been sectioned into asylums because when you see the kind of things they saw, and but that's everywhere across the South. So yes, it has changed me a bit. It's been a very, very stark reminder that true evil exists, and sometimes it just lets rip. I've described that Hamas has had 18 years to run the Gaza, and 18 years is the life of a child from childhood to adulthood. And they have tried to create a society of sociopaths. Mm-hmm. Psychopaths are born, but sociopaths are made. And the glee was, from the first moment I saw the video of the unedited footage, the glee was what struck me as being highly unusual. I've seen quite a lot of wars and quite a lot of evil, but I've very rarely seen so much glee whilst carrying out acts of evil. And but there is one other thing about it which has changed me, which is a positive thing, and that's this. Every Western country has this, I think everyone in the West has this question of the greatest generation. Those of us who grew up with stories from the First and Second World Wars, and then the people from the First World War died out, and then the people from the Second World War started to die out, and now, strangely, there are so few of them left. But there was always that question when I was growing up, which was, what would one do if it was one's grandparents' generation? Because it was pretty extraordinary. I mean, the fact that people from Canada were called across the ocean and went twice is remarkable. In my father's family, in the Outer Hebrides, nobody ever went anywhere. I mean, nobody left the island for centuries. Like, somebody came to Edmonton, but in the First World War, all the men were called up to the Navy, and then in the Second World War, all the men were called up to the Navy. No one had ever been abroad other than to France. And I always grew up wondering, what would it be like in my generation? And I do think that's something that should be asked. Pericles, in his funeral oration 2,500 years ago, says to the people of Athens, orient yourself by these men who've died, and judge yourself according to them. Now, in America, when Ukraine was invaded, there was a poll in which Americans were asked what they would do in the event of an invasion of America, like the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And only just over 50% of Americans said that they would stay and fight. It was a minority of Democrats, a slight majority of Republicans. Otherwise, the rest of them wanted to hot-foot it to Canada, assuming it wasn't you invading, which I'd like to take as a presumption that can be true. it was a pretty extraordinary thing. And then the other week, the defense secretary in Britain said if Ukraine does fail in its war against Russia, and if Russia does indeed invade the Baltics, which NATO seems to be preparing for the possibility of, the defense secretary in Britain said there will have to be conscription in Britain. This sort of passed by, but inevitably there was a poll. And among young people, a minority of people said that they would agree to be conscripted. And now, there are several things to be said about this. One is, of course, in both of these countries, I suspect it would be a similar result if this was polled here. In both these countries, of course, it's totally understandable. Because if you've been told that your country is rotten and racist and was vicious and appalling from the beginning, why the hell would you die for it? So that's a concerning one. But there's a second point to make on that, which is, of course, actually you don't know until you're tested. There was a famous vote at the Oxford Union in 1934. This House would not fight for king and country. And the House voted that they wouldn't fight for king and country. And all of these opinion pieces were written by people like me, attacking the younger generation as lily-livered and a disgrace to their country and so on. But of course, these ended up being exactly the young men who 5 years later signed up and went and fought. So you don't know, but this is a long-winded way of saying the positive thing that I've learned in Israel in recent months is that heroes come about through the events, and the young generation of Israelis are utterly heroic. I am deeply, deeply moved by them. A lot of older Israelis thought that the young Israelis had become soft, just like every other country thinks that the young have become soft. But to hear the stories, to know the people, I mean, you know, I have friends and friends' children who are serving, but also strangers. And things like on the day, you know, there's a brilliant young man, a few years young, he's in his 30s, who on the morning woke up, realized something was off, and drove south immediately and went to collect some guns. And his commander of his unit phoned him and said, everyone's coming back to base in Jerusalem. And he said, no, we have to go south. We have to go south now. And he said, you cannot defy the orders. He said, I'm defying the orders. And he drove south and he fought for the next 48 hours. And he saved a lot of lives. And he sent goodbye messages to his children and his wife on the way. Because he said, I was certain I would die. And just the whole country is filled with millions of stories like that. I was in the West Bank the other week and was with a grieving household whose beautiful 23-year-old daughter, who was a photographer, signed up to return to her unit on the 7th. Her parents begged her not to. She said, I absolutely cannot not be in the fighting, and I can't let down my unit. And 2 days later, she was in Sderot, and a rocket landed on her. And, you know, my view is Israel lives in reality. That's the truth of it. Israel lives in reality, which is a reality that the jungle is real. You know, the monsters really do exist. And I find one explanation for the lack of empathy for Israel in the West now is that we would rather push away the people who've discovered something we don't want to discover than to discover it ourselves. But, you know, as I say, the people in the West who obsess about this in such a negative way, they I mean, sorry, just one quick one. Somebody said to me at one of the Nova reunions, a young guy who'd seen the most terrible things, said to me, what would you do if this happened in your country? And I said, I don't know. But actually, the thing that went through my head was, but it has happened in my country. Not to that scale, but we had the Manchester Arena bombing, where 22 young girls were blown up for the crime of going to an Ariana Grande concert. The Bataclan in Paris, the terrorists went through the disabled section and shot everyone in the back of the head. So we have had tastes of it. But the other week I was sent a video of a concert at the Bataclan the other week where the crowd were all chanting Free Palestine. And so I sort of thought, well, again, maybe, and I have thought this for a long time, maybe instead of seeing that Israel is the forerunner of the West and the outpost of the West, there will be a type of person who blames Israel for our own problems. And you see it. My country, Britain, is struggling very badly with this at the moment. The Prime Minister just gave a very unusual announcement on the steps of Downing Street saying that our democracy is under threat because we had groups of Palestinian activists so intimidating members of Parliament that Parliament couldn't operate. Well, that's, you know, and people will say, oh, that's because Israel shouldn't be fighting in Gaza. No, it's because you've lost control of your country in London. Anyhow, it's a long-winded answer, but...
Well, we're getting, I think, 5 minutes we have left. Douglas, just to pursue this, your profession for a minute, you're one of the best-known journalists in the world today. What drew you to journalism as a profession?
Well, I think of myself as a writer. Journalism is a part of it. The truth is that I was always interested in words and language, and I was always interested in ideas. I thought originally when I was young I'd be a musician, and then I realized that music said something different. Whatever I had to say in words. And at least if I wrote music, it would be very angry music much of the time. No, I'm actually not an angry person particularly, but I realized at some point I was interested in ideas. That's the truth of it. And if you're interested in ideas, then you know you want to go and look at the most interesting things and throw yourself into them. And some years ago, a journalist in the UK, Melanie Phillips, said to somebody, Douglas has a very low tolerance threshold for lies. And I quite liked that, and I realized it was true. Then you might ask, well, why do you write about politics? It'll drive you mad. It's like being a swimmer who doesn't like water. Yes, I mean, my view is that the job of a writer is to sort of seize life by the throat and shake it and make it give up its secrets. One of my favorite writers, the late, great Oriana Fallaci, in her book about the Vietnam War, called Nothing and Amen, which is a magnificent book. The opening of the book, her niece, the opening is a great opening line. Oriana Fallaci could grab the reader by the throat and sort of shake them, keep their attention. The opening line of the book is, life, Oriana, what is it? And Fallaci says, the next day I flew to Vietnam to find out. And I suppose, yes, seeing life in its extremities is always interesting because it tells you what life is. Fallaci finished Nothing and Amen by saying to her niece, life is a thing that you fill and risk filling it so full that you break it by filling it. But yes, I think it's the job of a writer to look at unpleasant places and report back.
Now, according to my institute's, one of my institute's senior fellows, Eric Kaufman, who I think you may know, a Canadian, for those of you in the audience who don't know, Eric is a Canadian who teaches at Buckingham University now in the UK. And he wrote for us a paper about woke culture in Canada. And I quote, 55% of Canadian respondents say they trust journalists, compared to 37% of Americans and 16% of Britons.
Yes, in Britain we're slightly above politicians, but not much.
So you're a British journalist, a writer / journalist. Your countrymen have a low opinion of you.
Oh, yeah.
Should we trust you?
I like to think of not me personally. I mean, well, journalists haven't done very much to cover themselves in esteem in recent years. The truth is that something very interesting has happened in journalism in the last few decades. The money went. The money went in the 2000s when everything was free. And it meant that an odd thing happened. Either you made a career in it, like I did, by working very hard, writing with both hands for years, and also multitasking by writing books and articles and also doing television and radio. Or you did it because you had a trust fund or something, and that did happen. People who could afford to be in it. It became a little bit like acting. You know, actors tend these days to be from rather well-off backgrounds. Didn't used to be like that. And it was either that or people who were going into a profession which was being less and less well paid, but they sought payment through another means. I think it was Peter Thiel who first pointed this out to me, that journalists ended up in the period that the profession was being paid less and less well. They wanted to be paid in a different currency, and the other currency was the esteem of their peers. And this is a very, very interesting analysis of what has happened. I don't like journalists' awards and things, backslapping and, you know, and sort of journalist courage awards. I was thinking, the firefighters don't give themselves as many awards as journalists do. You know? People who literally run into burning buildings are never slapping each other at the back and having big banquets, you know. So I sort of object to all that. But it's true that, particularly in America, by the way, where the fall off in pay and the rise in esteem you are meant to get has really been prominent. I mean, the journalists, they will say that their job is to attack Donald Trump, for instance, or their job is to expose. I mean, it's one of the problems since Watergate. Everything is Watergate. It ruined journalism. Everything is like, we just uncovered the thing that will bring down the government. And most of the time it's no. You know, has this slip up by this minister revealed the... No. But it's very frenetic, it's very hysterical, and unfortunately, I pointed this out. I was in Canada in November the year before last, I think. I came to Toronto to do a monk debate opposite your fellow Canadian Malcolm Gladwell.
Yeah.
They didn't send their best that night. But we had a discussion about the mainstream media, whether you could trust the mainstream media. And I was fortunate enough to have Matt Taibbi on my side, and he was unfortunate enough to have Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times on his. But it was very interesting that we persuaded, I think through just facts, we persuaded the Toronto audience of, you know, I think uber-liberal Toronto types, to agree with us that the mainstream media was not to be trusted. And I thought that was very telling in itself, because these are all people who would, you know, read the correct papers and have the correct opinions and so on. But everybody at some point, whatever your political direction, has had a moment in recent years where they've seen through the media. And that is devastating. It's much worse than disliking something. It's the same with a person. Much worse than disliking a person is when you see through them. And I think the public have seen through the media, and but I think that skepticism is healthy. I really do. Again, the problem of the era is that it's hard to. You used to know what you were getting if you read the New York Times, and you still do. But there's a lot of other publications we don't quite know what we're getting. Some of the papers shift around in their positions. I mean, nobody has correspondence anymore. Think of that. We've all become a lot more parochial. That's one thing for sure. When I was growing up, the Express, which is a mid-market tabloid in the UK, had a Berlin correspondent, a Paris correspondent, a DC. They don't have any foreign correspondence anymore. And I think it's made us all rather narrow and rather parochial, all done in the name of anti-parochialism, which is odd.